Hello, everybody, and welcome. Happy Friday. Welcome back to Mythic Mission with Professor Michael Jahoski. We are on episode number 22 today already of Mythic Mission. We're about almost half a year in, and we've hit over 20 episodes. So very, very blessed to continue to bring these great episodes to you. And today, I'm very excited to introduce my guest as Dr. Brad Birzer. I'm going to tell you about what today's episode is about and introduce our guest. And then we're going to spend all this time talking to him about some great subjects today. So what I'd like to encourage you to do, and I'm going to try to do this toward the end of the episode, is leave any questions or comments you may have for our guest or for myself, and we'll take a look at them towards the end of the show. I'll try to, at least leave 5 or 10 minutes to talk about any questions or comments you may have. So I know there are some nerds out there that are going to be listening and have questions about what we'll be talking about today. And if you're not a nerd yet, you will be after this show, I guarantee you. All right. So episode number 22, I've entitled Estel, which is a word in Elvish meaning hope. It's one of 2 words that Tolkien uses in one of the texts we'll be talking today that means hope. It's also later in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings, what we learn to be one of Aragorn's, and elsewhere, one of Aragorn's names. And those of you who don't know who Aragorn is, you will know by the end of the show. And this is an episode where we'll be talking about kingship and incarnation in Middle-earth with our guest, Dr. Brad Birzer, who holds a Russell M. Kirk Chair in American Studies and is a professor of history at Hillsdale College in Michigan. He proudly serves on the boards of the Free Enterprise Institute and the Center for Cultural Renewal. In 2010, he co-founded the Imaginative Conservative website, and in 2012, he co-founded progarchy.com, which is a site dedicated to the exploration of music in all of its various forms. Dr. Birzer also writes for Ignatius Insight, Catholic World Report, and Catholic Vote. He earned a BA from the University of Notre Dame and a PhD from Indiana University. Now, among other great publications and contributions, as well as numerous book reviews, and he has his own website I'll be putting in the episode description today, Brad is the author of a book we'll be talking about today called J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, Understanding Middle-earth, which, Brad, if I'm not mistaken, was forwarded by Joseph Pierce. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And
very kindly.
Yes. We just had him on the show a few episodes ago, I think in April. So he was a joy to talk to. Yeah, it was a really great introduction to the book there. So we'll be honing in on that. And as just a quick bird's eye view of today's 22nd episode of Mythic Mission, Dr. Birzer and I will be discussing not only his book, but how monarchy in Middle-earth reflects Tolkien's Christian vision of God as king, and also an obscure but supremely important text in Tolkien's mythology called The Debate of Finrod and Andreth, which I'm sure a few of you have heard of, but many may not have heard of this text. If you're interested, you can find it in volume 10 of the History of Middle-earth called Morgoth's Ring. And this was edited by Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien. Dr. Birzer says in his book, which I mentioned a moment ago, of The Debate of Finrod and Andreth, that one should, quote, regard this as the central explanatory text of the theology of Tolkien's mythological world. This is from chapter 3 of his book. That's a pretty big statement. I agree completely. Today, among other topics, we'll be discussing exactly why that is. So, Dr. Birzer, thank you so much again for coming on Mythic Mission.
Oh, thanks for having me, Michael. It's great to be here.
Yes.
Very good.
It's a joy to have you. So, as you know, I sent you a list of some questions, and
Sure.
Just want to introduce you first and have you talk about how you first encountered Tolkien and when. Just tell us that story, and then we'll jump into some other things.
Yeah, I don't know how long you want me to go on that. That's something I could talk about for quite a while.
Yeah, that's
for,
good.
For better or worse.
Yeah.
I'm the youngest of 3 brothers. And so one brother is 8 years older and the other is 5 years older. And it was mostly because of their interest in Tolkien when I was little that I got interested in them as well. So I turned 10 in September of 1977. And that was September 6th. On September 15th, the Silmarillion came out for the first time. My oldest brother turned 18, I think, on September 23rd and got a copy of the Silmarillion. I had never read Tolkien up to that point, but if you remember, that original version of the Silmarillion had one of Tolkien's own paintings on it called The Mountain Path, which is that moment where the Hobbit and the dwarves are crossing into that lightning-filled area where the rocks are coming down in The Hobbit. And why they chose that for the cover of the Silmarillion, I'm not sure, but they did, and I was absolutely captivated by that painting. And I mean, I wanted, even as a 10-year-old, I wanted to jump into it. I wanted to be a part of it. So I actually kind of stole my brother's birthday gift, and I tried to read the Einendule, the opening. I tried to read that many times. I never got past it, but I probably read that 10 or 15 times as a little kid, and was deeply influenced. So now, Michael, what of this, and I maybe I shouldn't admit this, but at Hillsdale, we teach, for every professor in history teaches 4 courses of core, and our core are great books, great ideas.
Oh, cool.
And our opening day, we teach the first 3 chapters of Genesis. And I can never, ever read the first 3 chapters of Genesis without thinking of the Silmarillion.
Neither can I. And it's so beautiful, isn't it?
I hope that God's okay with that.
Yeah, I think so.
So anyway, the next summer, after I had tried to read through the Silmarillion, I had a lawn mowing business, and I saved up my money, and I rode my bike down to one of our bookstores in my little local town in Kansas, and bought the box set of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And I was 11 then, or going on 11, and my life is it's just never been quite the same. So
yeah, you discovered Tolkien
everything for me
very young. Yeah, I was I think I was just turning 16, so just a few years after you, but that's very young. And way to jump in the deep end with Tolkien with the Silmarillion.
Yeah, right. Probably that is not something I would recommend, especially to 10-year-olds.
Yeah, but that's amazing. And it's a great way to come to Tolkien, and that really is his. I mean, that's the heart and soul of the Lord of the Rings. I mean, we know from your book there's 600 quotations and allusions to the Silmarillion alone.
Yeah, right.
Just references in general. I mean, that's an enormous amount of allusions to this book. That's right. What he began, was it during the war or shortly after the First World War?
I mean, there's a bit of a debate about that, Michael, but from what I can tell, the beginnings of the mythology started about 1913, just a little bit before the war. I think it came to fruition during the war.
Sure.
But you can see some of his hints of things like Quarterion and others. Some of his earlier poetry was around 1913. So that's usually... But he always said it was quickened by the war, right? Is how he would put it.
That's right. I remember reading that in your book. Yes. Yeah, that's very early. And so I don't think a lot of our listeners are familiar. We haven't really talked a lot about the Silmarillion on the show, and let alone the debate. So that's going to be a fun fact for our listeners. So very good. Okay. Well, I think, for me personally, I'm interested. I hope my audience doesn't mind, but I wanted to ask you about why you became a Catholic, and I assume I should have asked you first, but you're still a practicing Catholic. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
So, what drew you to Catholicism? Were you always a Catholic? Did you convert? What was your story there? And what is it about the church that drew you to her?
Wow. So I mean, there's a lot that could go into that. I was raised Catholic. I'm a cradle, but I'm what's called a revert because I left for quite a while and then came back to the church. But for me, I grew up, just to give you an example of how crazy in a good way, how crazy my family was. My maternal grandmother, I was very close to her. My maternal grandmother was the oldest girl of 17 children. I mean, these were big Catholic families, and I grew up in Kansas I'm just surrounded by great aunts and great uncles, surrounded by aunts and uncles as well, but great aunts and uncles everywhere. We visited them all the time. It was always a part of what I did. And so I grew up going to Mass. I started rejecting it, and now looking back, I don't know exactly why, but I started rejecting it about the time I became a teenager, and I still had to go to Mass. I didn't have a choice. My mom, basically forced me to go, and I'm glad she did. But at the time I wasn't glad, but I'm glad now. And I didn't really stop going to Mass though until I left for college. And crazily enough, I went to Notre Dame. And for whatever reason, I just had no image that Notre Dame would be as devoutly Catholic as it was. I thought it'd be kind of Catholic in name only.
Right.
And my best friend, just an incredible guy, was a devout Catholic, and he and I would just argue and argue and argue and have these debates, as you only can when you're a college age student, late to like 2 or 3 in the morning. And he convinced me that Catholicism was right, and so I came back to the church after
Very
that.
interesting.
I did kind of mess around with some other churches. I played around with the Lutherans for a while, and I respect the Lutherans very much.
Yes.
I went to a Reformed church for quite a while when I was in grad school, but I always came back to the Catholic Church. And even when I went to the Lutheran and the Presbyterian churches, I would go and then go to Mass afterwards. So I would go to 2 services on Sunday, sometimes 3, and I would do all of it.
I wonder, that's great. I wonder if it's not the liturgy of the Mass itself and the formulaic sort of approach that the Catholics take to it, that the structured approach and the, you know what you're going to get, and you can always commune at the Lord's table, and that kind of constancy, I think, maybe drew me. Maybe I'm speaking for myself, but
sure,
my experience in Protestant churches has not always been that, first of all, there's not regular communion, and it's not Mass. It's very different, and the liturgy is very different. But I never felt as much of a, and I'll just kind of say it bluntly, there's not such a deeply entrenched mythos there. And I never felt like I understood the roots of Protestantism until I was much older. So I think part of the thing that drew me back, and probably part of my story has been back and forth with Catholicism, is that I miss the mystery of the Mass, the structure of it, and just the beauty of it. I think it's the aesthetic element, maybe, is what I'm trying to say, that maybe draws a lot of people back, because there's sights, there's sounds. I don't want to disparage Protestants, because I don't think that's, it's accurate to say they don't have that, but there's just like Bishop Barron has said, there's a Catholic thing, I think is the way he puts it. So it's sometimes hard to describe. And Mary too is another subject perhaps we could talk about another time, but that was something that also drew me back. And I think you've, read probably early parts of my book. We were thinking about returning to the Catholic Church. At least for me, it was a return. My wife was raised Lutheran. And at the time of the publication of the book. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we just had to pray on it. We had some other questions. I talked to some other friends. I actually was doing some interviews on my book, and was talking to some pretty hard Reformed guys who were giving me things to think about. And we're still kind of wrestling with it. It's something that's always, I'll say, maybe my Protestant friends won't appreciate this, but I still pray my rosary, even though I'm not really in the church. But anyway, that's wonderful. So, is there something?
For me, Michael, for me, it was what always kept me, even when I didn't really believe. The communion always drew me.
That's what I was going to ask.
And so did Mary. I love the idea of a mother who just always welcomes us back. There's something very powerful about that. Well, but I also have to admit, there's a very practical thing for me. Because I grew up with all these aunts and uncles, I saw how faithful they were. And they are, some are still very much alive. Some aren't, as you can imagine, having that many. But they lived their faith in everything that they did. And that was a real draw to me, to see that it wasn't hypocritical. It wasn't just formulaic, that they actually did live that. So that was very helpful for me.
And that's wonderful. Yes, because I don't think that's everybody's experience. And I think, many Catholics I've spoken to say it was just something you did. And even some of my New York side of the family who grew up Catholic on my mom's side, I think that was sort of the thing. Sometimes it's, you just went, that's what parents told you to do. And we don't understand any of this. So that's great that they lived it, they breathed it, they understood it. And, that's a problem across the church, is sometimes Christians, they don't understand what they're doing. I know as a young Christian, I felt the same way. But that's what I was going to ask you, is what really kind of drew you back, and you answered it, and what kept you. And I would agree, Mary is a draw for me. One of the things that changed my outlook is having a daughter, number one, and the way it just, in a way that's sometimes inexplicable, changes your worldview. Two is, and I'm not against the patriarchal, and I don't mean that in the woke sense, but
Sure.
the referring to God as Father. This is how Scripture refers to God. That's wonderful. But I sometimes feel that in liturgy and just in church in general, I wasn't hearing enough about Mary. And sometimes I feel like we overlook Mary. And I know that many Protestants know how important she is, but there's very much a difference in how Catholics and Protestants view Mary. I think that's one of the things that I don't want to say divides us, but which we disagree over.
And I can freely admit as a Catholic that some
Yeah.
Catholics take it way too far.
I
So,
agree with that.
yeah,
Yes.
they do.
Yes.
When they start
Mariology.
referring to her as the co-redemptrix, and that's too much.
I agree. I have some concerns about that as well. And I've talked to some Reformed folks, especially who, that's I think a relatively new development too in the
It
church,
is.
in church history, where that title was given to her.
Yeah, last 20 some years.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Well, as much as I'd love to talk about Mary and perhaps another show in the future,
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
but I'm glad. Thank you so much for telling us about that. And I just wanted to kind of share some of my own story and see.
Thanks for yours. Likewise.
Oh, no, it's
Yeah.
my pleasure. We're still praying about it, so prayers are appreciated. Well, moving on from that, let's talk about your book. I know it's been some years since you published it. I think was it 2003?
Right. I wrote it between about 1999 and 2002.
Oh,
And then
cool.
it came out right at the end of 2002.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
So that I
So
think was
right at Christmas at that point.
So that's perfect timing too for people who were discovering Tolkien through film. And
Yes.
part of my own journey kind of overlapped with that.
It came out with the Two Towers.
Oh,
So
how lucky.
it was lucky.
That's good timing. That's good. People are like, I'm buying this.
That was not intentional on my part, but
No.
yeah. In fact, when I started the book, I started it in large part because I read Joseph Pierce. And I mean, there's actually a whole story behind this, but I loved Pierce's Tolkien Man and Myth. I absolutely loved it. But if you remember in that book, he doesn't go into detail in the larger mythology. He really focuses on the Lord of the Rings.
Indeed.
And so one of the things I wanted to do with my own was not just focus on the Lord of the Rings, but really look at the Silmarillion and the history of Middle Earth.
Yes.
And I thought that there was still room. I thought what Joseph did was fantastic, but I thought there was still room to keep going with some of those ideas.
Yes, and as you know, I mean, there's so much to continue plumbing the depths of Tolkien's, mythology. There's so much to say, and I felt it was very intimidating stepping into the arena, but there's a lot still.
Oh, there's still a lot to be said.
Yes.
And I have not finished your book yet, Michael, but I'm very taken with what you've written so far. And I think the idea of parable, especially, and taking that from Father Murray, I thought that was just fantastic.
Thank you.
So
and
I think you're really onto something.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad you mentioned Murray, because I don't think a lot of people that I've spoken with are familiar with that essay, which was a sermon that he gave.
Right. Yeah.
In 1992.
I've got it right back here.
Yeah.
In that green volume.
Yes, that's right. I have it in, I think, Pierce's Tolkien: A Celebration. It's one of the many collected essays.
Oh, okay. Yep.
Yeah, which is another way you can get it. But it was, I think, a Thanksgiving sermon he gave at the centenary in 1992.
Right.
And then it, obviously you can get it in essay form. It's very short, and I tell people they should read it because that was really the germ of the idea for me. And I don't know how many people have heard of Sally McFague's Speaking in Parables book, but that was another one that.
No, I wasn't familiar with that.
Yeah, she mentions actually, and I cite this obviously in my book, the precedent for referring to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings as a parabolic novel. That was her phraseology, and I think that's very key. So I appreciate your comments and hope you enjoy the rest of the book. But there's so much to say about Tolkien's work that even when I finished, I thought to myself, wow, there's so much more we could have written about here. But tell us about.
That's good. That's your next book. Then you've got more to do.
Oh God, we'll see. I was thinking. Yeah, I was thinking actually I have some ideas to talk about C.S. Lewis. I featured a lot of Lewis's writings and ideas in the book because, as you know, they were for many and most years very close. And Lewis learned so much and was nourished by so much of Tolkien's views, as you talk about in your book, on myth. And I think most people are probably familiar with that connection, but to the extent of which I learned was just very, very profound. And so in writing the book, I said, maybe another idea, my next book would be on Lewis, but we'll see.
Great.
Tell us more about your book, J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, Understanding Middle Earth. What were you trying to accomplish? You kind of hinted at that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So, the interesting backstory, at least interesting to me, backstory is that I had finished my dissertation in late 1998 and defended it in 99. And I wrote on the American frontier during the American Revolution. So nothing to do with Tolkien at all.
Right.
And I'm proud of what I did with the dissertation, but I was really burned out. I'd been working on it since about 94. It took me close to 5 years to write. And that's all I was really thinking about were basically the American Revolution and the frontier. And topics I like, but I just was really burned out, and I didn't want to go on with that. And I was with a very, very close friend of mine, one of my closest friends. He and I founded the Imaginative Conservative together. And we were driving around Houston, and he knew how burnt out I was. But he also knew that being in academia, I had to get a book out, I had to publish, had to do something. And so he said to me, if you could write about anything you wanted to, whatever book you wanted to write on, what would it be? And I, without any hesitation, I said, I'd write a book on Tolkien. I had, during my undergrad, I had taken a course called Philosophy and Fantasy. And I had written a paper for that. In fact, I've got it right back here, but I had written a paper for that that really is, in many ways, the outline of my book. And so I had been taken with that topic. I had thought about that topic for a long time. And so my friend, who's pretty well connected, Winston, told me, he said, look, do what you want, do what you love, and whatever power I have, we'll make sure it gets published.
That's awesome.
So,
wow.
I mean, he was great about it. And I ended up finding a publisher pretty quickly, pretty amazingly. So it all kind of just fell into place. And then I devoured the topic and wrote that book. Wrote it maybe a little bit faster than I would have liked. I actually was planning on about another year to write it. But with the Two Towers coming out, my publisher wanted it done. And so I sent in what I had to them. They still cut out about a third of the book. It's about a third shorter than the manuscript that I sent them. And I still had quite a bit more I wanted to talk about, but I thought it turned out well. And I was
do too.
happy with it.
Yes,
maybe it made it a better book to be cut down. I don't know.
Well, that's what the publishers tell me too. And, I admit in reflecting, the introduction to my book did not turn out the way I wanted, and really would have liked to cut back on things. And then there were other places I wanted to say more. And so, it is what it is. No book is really perfect or finished. I think there's always something you'd like to cut, you'd like to add. But I'd be interested to see that other chunk of writing that you've got. I loved your book, obviously. I hope that's obvious, and cited you, quite frequently throughout the book. Thank you. And it's a lovely book. I have some favorite sections. I mean, I love the entire book. Quite honestly, there's not a place I was ever bored or dragged on. I always learned something new. One of the great insights was that not many Catholic magazines or news channels, coverages, I don't know what the appropriate word would be at that time, were looking at Tolkien's books. They kind of overlooked it, and that upset him. That was an insight I had never known before.
Yeah, he was very upset about that. And really, and understandably, I mean, this is a devout Catholic under siege in England. And I think he thought that he deserved a little bit better reception than what he got. And yet, of course, some of the Catholics that did review it praised it very, very highly. But a lot of the major Catholic publications just ignored it. And there's a lot when and you know this very well, Michael, and your audience probably knows this very well. But of course, when Tolkien first came out, it was only reviewed in a few places. What became Tolkien, the legend, took 10 years, right? It wasn't until 1965 and 66 that book really took off, a full 10 years after it had been out. And it wasn't until it came out in paperback. And that's what really, and of course with the 60s and all the craziness of the 60s and all the hippies adopting it, it became a kind of niche, and yet more than a niche book. But that's where that initial drive of Tolkien becoming Tolkien.
Right.
That's where that really came
Known.
from.
That's right. Yeah. And of course, I could go on about some of the interesting things I learned. There's so much. But another thing that I think readers will appreciate about your book is learning some of the, I want to choose the right word here, his concerns and disagreements with Protestantism in general. Tolkien's maybe sometimes uncharitable comments, or, maybe even another word would be apropos, but he had understandably so, but interesting things to read, I think, in, what was that, chapter 2 or 3 of your book. I just picked up so many interesting insights into the man's life, and looking at him and his mind, and I appreciated that a great deal. But really what took the cake for me was learning about the debate of Finrod and Andreth, which we'll come to shortly.
Sure.
That, and one other insight, which I'd like to approach first, which is, I think, prominently discussed in chapters 3 and 4 in your book. But something that just kind of clicked with me, there were several things that clicked when I was researching this connection, and maybe we'll have to give some backstory for some of our audience, but between Iluvatar, which is one of the names for the deity of Middle Earth, and Arda, more broadly speaking, the world, and Manwë, one of the Valar,
Right.
which is another thing we can talk about to clarify for listeners. And then the king in Middle Earth of the Númenóreans that eventually would come to be destined to rule over all of Middle Earth. And I thought that insight was interesting. And it was coming to me around the same time when I was learning how to understand the Gospels better. And N.T. Wright's writing was extremely influential on my own thinking in looking at the Gospels as stories of how God became king. And I always thought, it's interesting, when people ask Christians, what is the incarnation? How do you understand that? What does it mean? And I had always heard, oh, it just means that Jesus is God, and that's it. And I thought, that just doesn't seem complete to me. And so between the insight in your book and in the writings of N.T. Wright, I started to kind of sense this connection. I said to myself, I feel like I've heard this story before. And that's what made me look back on the Lord of the Rings and think, I really see this theme of God becoming king very prominent in Middle Earth. And that, God is ruling through, his king in Middle Earth. And I want to explore that connection. And I think we need to kind of define some terms for some of our audience: Iluvatar, Arda, the Valar, and also have you weigh in on what you think are the archangels, or the angels. So, perhaps where do you think we should start? At the top with the big guy?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, your book is about kingship in so many ways, right? I mean, you're the guy to talk about this.
Yeah.
I'm doing a project. I don't know if you've heard of this woman, and I've never met her in person. I've only corresponded with her, a European scholar by the name of Carolina Armenteros. And her thing, what she does in history, and I guess she's pretty well known, what she does as history is she writes on monarchy since the French Revolution, and tries to figure out how monarchs have changed since the French Revolution. But she's putting together a 2-volume work right now on various conservative monarchies. And actually, much to my surprise, she contacted me and wants me to write, even though all of these other things are historical, she wants me to write a chapter on Tolkien's vision of monarchy. And so, of course, you're going to be all over that, what I'm doing, Michael.
Absolutely. Want to hear more.
So I've been thinking about this a lot, and I've got to spend the summer thinking about it. But it is interesting. Tolkien, of course, calls himself in his letters an unreconstructed monarchist, right? He's a monarchist, or an unconstitutional monarchist, a monarchist without limitations. And I've wondered about that, but I think it's exactly what you're saying. I think what he means by that is when it's appropriately done, as with Iluvatar being God the Father, when you have something like that, or you have a Manwë, who I would consider to be a kind of Saint Michael figure. When you have these kingship elements, they have to rule in a certain way. And of course, think about the Lord of the Rings. We have 3 major kings in there, right? We've got Theoden, who's kind of a good pagan. Then we have Denethor, who's a terrible pagan. And then we have Aragorn, who really kind of is a Christian king in the way that he rules. But then we can't forget, we've also got the head of the ring wraiths, who was the king of Angmar.
Oh yeah, wow.
And so there are
Huh.
kings throughout the story that run from the absolute diabolic to the pure and good.
Yes.
And so that, I think when we're thinking about kingship with Tolkien, I think it's a really complicated story. And I think Tolkien can see that these monarchies can go very bad.
Sure. And I think it's important we pause there to explain to people that maybe, and I also recommend the writings of N.T. Wright on this, as an Englishman writing from, constitutional monarchy perspective. He writes in one of his books, I think, How God Became King, that this is a baffling idea for many Americans. We fought a revolution for among many reasons to, George Washington had levees early in his presidency where people would come in and refer to him as His Excellency, and I think bow to him, and he became quite uncomfortable with that.
He did not like that. No,
not at all. I think he's like, this is a bad idea. Let's change that. Too soon, as what we would say. So, I think Americans are like, huh, what? Monarchy, that's regressive, that's oppressive. But as you said, when it's done correctly, and of course that's seldom in human history not, or seldom is, done correctly. This is a providential and wonderful thing. But more to the point, in the Bible, God is, among many other things, bridegroom, other things, seen and understood as king. I remember in the passage, 1 Samuel 8, where the Israelites are asking for a king, they're asking for a human king like the other nations. And God even just says, they're rejecting me as king today. This has nothing to do with you, Samuel. It's all about me. They've been doing this.
Such an amazing passage.
It is. And it's also a weird passage for a lot of people to understand, because we have problems already imagining a human as a king, let alone God, which many people just don't believe exists to begin with. So it's just a very baffling concept, which might be a barrier to reading our books and what you're working on. So I think people have to wrap their brains around that to understand what Tolkien is up to in his books. But it's clearly very important to him, as we've begun to talk about. So Iluvatar is, the God the Father figure. He's the
ultimate
creator.
king, right?
Yes, exactly. That's right. And Manwë is a Valar. For those of you that don't know, and there's many opinions on this, but the Valar are among two groups, the higher pay grade of divine beings, that are non-human divine beings who are kind of, I would say, God's counsel. Now, I know the prevailing perspective has been to view them as angels or archangels, but I would see them as, and I argue in my book, the divine council, God's, non-human divine family surrounding his throne. Underneath them are the Maiar, who, among whom we find Gandalf and Sauron, who are names that people will recognize probably instantly. And people are always baffled to hear that Gandalf is a lower divine being. It's really interesting.
It's an incarnate angel.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And Tolkien writes about this in his letters. So, Manwë is in the Silmarillion. We're told he's the destined to be first of all kings of Arda. And so this is where we start to see the triune sort of, I think, theology of Tolkien. I know we have to be delicate here, but you also make a connection. So Iluvatar to Manwë, but to the kings of Numenor, I think. And I think most specifically because they're destined to unite Middle Earth. That was their role. Right. And so I found that to be really interesting, and how Aragorn figures into that story. Is there anything else we can expound on that connection? Iluvatar, Manwë, Aragorn. Is there anything else we can say, you think?
I feel like I'm being too negative here, but remember, the Numenorians go so bad.
Oh yes.
Right, as well. They fall, but when they're good, they are truly good and truly interesting. And then but we could also add in, think about how dependent the hobbits are, even in their language, when there is no king, but they still say, but that's the king's rule, or this is how the king thinks, right? It becomes in many ways kind of a form of common law, that there is this being somewhere that takes care of these things. So even the sheriffs in the Shire are empowered by the fact that there's a king, but of course there is no king, not before Aragorn, but they keep talking that way. So you do get all kinds of discussion of kingship. I think that's really important. But I mean, just imagine one of the three books is called The Return of the King. So clearly Tolkien is very interested in this idea. One of the things I came across recently, Michael, and I didn't know this until I was studying, so partly on a book I'm working on right now on the Inklings, I got really interested in the great Scottish thinker Andrew Lang. If you remember Lang, he's the one Tolkien gives the Lang lectureship when he's at the University of St. Andrews. And so I got interested in Lang himself because Tolkien is obviously at least influenced by Lang. And I didn't realize this, but there was a whole neo-monarchist movement in the 1890s that really did kind of focus on the Stuarts in Scotland. And T.S. Eliot was a part of this. T.S. Eliot had an image of the king on his dorm wall. Christopher Dawson, one of my favorite scholars, who also was a friend of Lewis and Tolkien's, had a picture of the king on his dorm wall. Now, I don't know if Tolkien did, but I think that there's something that kind of neo-monarchism, I'm guessing, influenced him as well.
That's huge. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm conjecturing here. I don't have proof for that, Michael, but it just seems to fit with several things that Tolkien says, both in his letters as well as in his fiction.
Certainly. Yeah. And I think, the important theological takeaway point for this is that this flows from Tolkien's theology as a Christian, is that God is in charge of all aspects of our lives. He's not, the sacred secular split is so commonplace today. He's not privatized and pigeonholed into just one aspect of our life.
Well put.
Yeah, thank you. God permeates all aspects of existence. He's not just something we take off the shelf when we feel like it. So I think to understand, and this is metaphor, right? God as king means, well, we know what a king is like. We have concrete examples of this in history. What is that like? What is it like when God shows up? Well, it's like having a king over us, and a king demands things of us. He demands obedience. He demands, there's taxes or all sorts of things that go with this, and certain obligations. And I think people need to start thinking along those lines as to maybe what Tolkien was trying to say in his writings, is that he was looking at God in a particular way, but God doesn't make the kinds of claims on us that earthly kings make, a much greater claim. So for those of you that are just wondering why we're exploring this topic, that's why is it gives us an insight into how Tolkien understood God. And of course, this goes right back to scripture, where God in the Psalms is frequently referred to as king, and of course in the hints in Jesus's parables and elsewhere throughout the prophets. And it's from start to finish in scripture. You just have to open up the Bible and look. So I think maybe we can start segueing into our last topic, because we'll have some more opportunity to talk about kingship with a discussion of the debate of Finrod and Andreth, this central text in understanding Tolkien's theology and his mythology as well. Should we kind of give a sketch? We said where we could find it, volume 10, The History of Middle-earth, Morgoth's Ring. This was a complete and finished story, as I understand it, written in the late 1950s, most likely, although that's not exactly known. So this is after, for those of you that are wondering, after the publication of The Return of the King, which was what, 54, 55?
55, yeah.
55. So I think the prevailing opinion is the debate of Finrod and Andreth was 1959. So shortly after the publication of The Lord of the Rings, the final part of The Lord of the Rings. And we need to kind of probably tell our audience what this story is about. I mean, it's about many things. There are several themes. When within the mythos itself, when does it take place in the history of Arda? Can we just start sketching it?
Sure. Yeah. So it's in the First Age, later in the First Age, where there's a discussion, and Finrod is one of the great elf lords, and Andreth is a human wise woman. And what's interesting too, Michael, and I wondered why Christopher made the decision that he did, but it does say, and Christopher's quite clear in his notes about this. So Christopher Tolkien, the son of J.R.R. Tolkien, Christopher's quite clear that his father said that this work must appear in the Silmarillion as a part of the appendices.
Wow. And
of course it doesn't. Right. And that's interesting in and of itself. It's interesting that Christopher chose not to do it. It's equally interesting that Christopher admits later that This is what his
Chosen.
father wanted, and he
Huh.
chose not to do it, without actually giving an explanation of why he chose not to do it. So I came across, when I was doing my own work on J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, I came across the original of this in the Wade Center over at Wheaton College. And it's almost identical to what we have. The differences are really slight.
Okay.
But what's so fascinating, of course, and this gets to the heart not only of the Lord of the Rings, but it gets to the heart of everything Tolkien is really asking about. The main question that the elves and that the humans have at this point, at least as discussed between Andrith and Finrod, is the question of what is our nature, right? What is the nature of our soul? What's the extent of our soul? What's the limitation of our soul? Why is it that the elves seem to live forever, but the humans only have this short lifespan? And can that be explained in some way by the possibility that Iluvatar, Eru, same name, a different name for the same character,
right.
That Iluvatar has in some way created the elves and the humans to be unique, each in their own fashion. And I would argue that at some level, the elves probably have, because of their immortality, probably have more in common with the Maiar and the Valar than they do with men.
Yes.
Men seem to have a different kind of fate, but it's not a bad fate. And in this conversation, then, not to take this too long, but in this conversation, the whole idea of an incarnation comes up. A very powerful conversation about the incarnation comes up. How is God going to redeem the world? Could the artist actually enter into his painting? Could the author enter into his book? And that's really the crux of that discussion. And I'm astounded when I read scholars who think that Tolkien's Catholicism is just something that's kind of over here as one part of lots and lots and lots of things to understand about Tolkien. But to me, if you have a discussion like that about the incarnation, and you're trying to figure out how Jesus could come into your mythology, that doesn't seem marginal to me. That seems central.
No, I quite agree. And there's a lot here. I'll kind of mention a few things, and we'll just maybe pick a piece here and a piece there of the debate. But you've said several things that I think people will be interested about. First of all, the incarnation does figure very prominently at about midpoint through the dialogue. But what's really fascinating here is two things. Number one, Andreth and Finrod both refer to this. I think Andreth especially. This is the female character in the dialogue. Remember that this is an old hope already, and now this is only the first age, folks. The Lord of the Rings takes place, as does The Hobbit, in the third age.
At the end of the third age.
At the end of exactly, which is very important.
We're thousands of years away.
So get this then. So the old hope, it's already old, but we're only in the first age. So this has been something that has, and actually the text hints that there are followers, people who believe in this and talk about this old hope, of which Andreth doesn't really say she's not a part of it. She seems to be very skeptical. I didn't say that I was a part of this. I just said that there are people who think this. She's very bitter in the dialogue, and she has, I think, understandable reasons. There's a lot there. Second thing that's very important about the incarnation here is that it's mentioned in reference to this idea of the word Estel, which is one of the two words. Is this not Sindarin? I forget which of the Elvish languages. I'm not sure either. I'm not an expert, but it's an Elvish word for hope or trust. And it's the deeper kind of hope and trust, as opposed to Amdir, which is another word for it. But Estel is one of the monikers and one of the titles of Aragorn that's later given by, I think, his mother, if I'm not mistaken.
I can't remember, Michael.
I think it's an Appendix A of the Lord of the Rings. So what I found very interesting is that this really kind of, in a way, points forward to Aragorn. And what I started asking is, what would the incarnation look like in Middle-earth if it was present? And to me, I saw the connection in seeing, this is about God becoming king and ruling. And the text also hints that when this happens, it wouldn't necessarily mean that all of the evils of the world would go away. There's one part of the text that seems to hint at that, like this is the beginning of Arda being healed. This is the first step in that. But it makes me think that many Tolkien scholars have missed the mark here in saying, well, the Lord of the Rings can't be a Christian story because it's a sad story. But I think that's precisely why it is, because even after Christ's incarnation, there's still work to be done. We still
Right.
have to suffer, hope, and die. So I find this to be, as you said, the central text. So very interesting that we ponder that. But the text, as you hinted at, is about other things as well. The nature of the body and soul.
Right.
And I think maybe we should speak to that. Resurrection is not just hinted at, it's explicitly stated at one point that it seems that one day the Fea, the soul, will raise up the body, or that they will be raised up somehow and become imperishable. And there's a comment that the body is not an inn to keep a traveler warm for a night. So Tolkien seems to be combating Gnosticism,
Right.
this idea that many Christians have had over the centuries, that we die and go away to some other place and our bodies are unimportant. So would you say that that's correct about Tolkien's views, that he's...
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting too, especially since you're thinking about writing on C.S. Lewis. It's so similar to what Lewis says in Mere Christianity, right? We have a body. We're saved not by the body, but in the body, through the body, and we have a resurrected body later on. And so, our very material, our very physical thing. I mean, this is important that God gave us this body and gave us the soul as well. But the body and the soul have to go together in some way. And that's part of the confusion on the part of Andreth as well as Finrod, trying to figure out, well, why is it that the elvish soul seems to go to the halls of Mandos, but we don't know where the human soul goes afterwards, right? That's I mean, they're really perplexed about this and trying to figure out why the nature of each creature is different. And that's also why I think that the elves are more angelic in some way. I think they're a very lower form of angel in some way.
It seems... Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, please, Michael, go ahead.
No, I was just going to follow up and say, I think you're right about that insight about the elves, because it seems that Iluvatar is going to keep them in the halls of Mandos. Mandos, I believe, is another one of the Valar, if I'm not mistaken. He's a kind of, I don't want to say this is a one-for-one, but a Hades-esque kind of...
Yeah, he's the god of the dead.
Figure, God of the dead, quite poignantly. And so he seems to keep them. And I always have questions about reincarnation and Tolkien's views on that. Maybe we can talk about that. But it seems like they have a very different posthumous destiny than men do. And as you said, we don't know what happens to man. And I think that's one of the things that troubles Andreth in the dialogue, which makes it, as you say in your book, very Job-like, which is also interesting. Suffering and evil and death comes up prominently in this dialogue. So
and Andreth has suffered much.
Oh yes,
right.
Yes.
I mean, that's a huge part of her bitterness as well, trying to figure this out.
Yeah, and I think there's some unrequited love. Is it Finrod's brother? I can't remember the details, but they talk about either. There's some other character in the dialogue that she's got some pain of separation, unrequited love. I think she's in love with another elf lord, and it's not returned. But I'm sure some of the other nerds out there can help us fill in the gaps. We can't cover everything. Yes, let us know in the comments. So anyway, she has some really interesting things to say, but in that, I think this bitterness that she has is also wrapped up in another really interesting concept maybe we should speak to. So resurrection, incarnation, a healed age that we can look forward to, this idea of a new age of Arda coming in. But I was going to say about the fall of man is hinted at here, and it seems like Andreth doesn't want to talk about what it is that made mankind in the mythology marred. But they are somehow. She doesn't talk about it, and I think it's in another writing at the end, the tale of Adenel, where we get the scoop on this. So do you remember exactly what it is that men did?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't.
I'm going to try to look at my notes to see if I have it. I think it, I want to make sure it's in the right place, but there is, at least what we can say here while I'm looking, an allusion to the fact that we fell. There's a fall in Middle-earth.
Right.
That was already off stage by the time they're talking. This is something that's already transpired.
Right. That's what I remember about it.
Mhm.
I didn't remember getting details about how it happened.
Yeah, I think, it seems like something, I might be confusing this with the creation of the orcs, which I think was a perversion of the elves.
Right.
But I distinctly remember something about men listening to the enemy. Melkor is the name of the first big bad guy, or Morgoth, in the Silmarillion. And I think it has something to do with they listened to his voice rather than Iluvatar's voice,
Mm,
and they started to worship. And again, I could be conflating this with the story of the elves, but they started to worship Morgoth or Melkor rather than Iluvatar. And so, in a sense, this is a Eden-esque type story.
right.
So for
And a foreshadowing of what happens in Numenor.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
absolutely.
Which again, that's another part of the mythos. But later in was it the Second Age, the Numenorians begin to well, actually, Sauron is there on the island of
Right.
Numenor, and he's
Right.
whispering in the king's ear that we should start worshiping his master, which is Melkor, and
Yeah.
not Iluvatar. And they start. Do they build a temple, or they pervert the temple that they
Oh, they
had there?
pervert to the temple, yeah, and start
Yeah.
committing sacrifices.
Oh yes, that's
Yeah.
right. And then that's one of the reasons, not the ultimate reason, that Numenor falls. I think it's because they sail to the Undying Lands in the
Right.
west. But
Right.
this is
Try
part
to
of the
conquer
ban.
it.
Eeh, yeah, and we have that Atlantis-esque sort of story,
Yeah.
which Tolkien was quite clear about was
Yeah.
one of the inspirations. So
I,
very
I don't know about you,
intriguing.
Michael, but of the three ages, I'm utterly fascinated with the Second Age.
Me too.
I just there's
Yeah,
so much richness in it. In
there
part
is.
because Tolkien didn't explore it quite as much as the other ages. So
Agreed.
there's a lot
Agreed.
that's left to the imagination there.
Which is why I'm worried about the Amazon series a little bit.
Oh,
A little bit, which I
uh,
don't want to. Sorry, I brought it up, folks, but
yeah,
yeah, I know that's gonna set some
yep,
comments
yep,
off.
yep. We're
Well,
gonna have our work cut out for us when that happens.
oh my gosh. Well, I hope it goes off okay, but we'll see. So, yeah, I think this might be a good place to stop. We've talked about what we came here to talk about. Any final things we should say, you think, that listeners need to know about these topics that we've talked about today? And then I'll see if we have any
These are great,
questions.
Michael. I've really enjoyed this.
Me
Thank you.
too. Oh, thank you
Great
so
to talk
much.
about. Good for the brain and good for the soul.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We'll see. I'm logging onto Facebook here to see if we had any comments. And if not, we can start wrapping things up. I am going to post your website, link to your website, and to link to your book so that people can find
That's
where to
great.
purchase
Thank
it,
you.
of course.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Doesn't look like I have any at this time, but that's great, folks. You can always write me on Facebook or contact me on Twitter if you have any comments or questions. And we can always redirect them to Brad somehow and see if he can answer them.
Absolutely. Yeah, anything would be great.
Great.
Good.
Good. Well, this was phenomenal. Thank you all for listening to our episode today. And Dr. Birzer, thank you so much again for coming
Yeah,
on the
thank
show.
you, Michael. It was my pleasure. Really
Okay.
great.
Yeah.